Hello, everyone, and welcome to the International Macro History Online Seminar Series. I'm Natasha Postel-Vinet. I'm an assistant professor in economic history at the London School of Economics. And today I'm very pleased to welcome Alain Naef, who's a research economist at the Banque de France. He's been there since last summer. Before that, he was a postdoctoral researcher at Berkeley. And he's also completed his PhD recently from Cambridge University. Alain Naef's research focuses mainly on the financial history of the 20th century with a specific focus on central banking history. He's written on Bretton Woods in particular, but also on central banking foreign exchange market interventions, which is what this paper is actually going to be about. So the first thing I'm going to ask you, as usual, is to please ask your questions in the Q&A chat box. In the Q&A box. So I shouldn't say the chat box because the chat box is actually disabled. So in the Q&A interface. And if you've got any clarifications, and only clarifications, you can write them, flag them as clarification questions in the Q&A box. But most of the Q&A questions will be stored for afterwards, after Alain Naef's talk, which is going to be in about 45 minutes. So today's paper is going to be on the Bank of England's foreign exchange interventions, the effectiveness of the foreign exchange interventions of the Bank of England between around 1950 and 1992, if I'm correct. So without further ado, Alain, the floor is yours. Go ahead.
Perfect. Thanks a lot. Let me just share my slides. Okay, great. Yeah, thanks a lot for this great introduction. So actually, the original paper was starting in 1950, but I've sort of shortened it a bit. So what you'll see today is starting in 87 roughly, but there's a longer version out there for those who are interested on a longer time frame. Maybe let me start with the basics. So these views do not represent the views of the Banque de France or the Euro system. That's just the usual disclaimer. And I'm very excited to be here today, really. This is a great opportunity to present to you some work I've been working on for a few, well, at least more than a year at least now, and which started when I was in Berkeley. So very excited about this. So that is Blowing Against the Wind, and we'll be looking at a narrative approach on central bank intervention. And so there's going to be a lot of points on methodology and hopefully also some interesting history. So first, I'm going to try to motivate why we should be interested in foreign exchange intervention. This might be especially true in advanced markets where we don't see it that often. But there are some central banks that are intervening, and one of them is the Swiss National Bank, for example. And because of these interventions, the SNB, the Swiss National Bank, now owns roughly 0.3% of Apple. Because they've bought a lot of dollars and then they had to invest them, and they've invested them into US stocks, and one of them being Apple or Procter & Gamble and all the big US stocks. I think another reason to be very excited about foreign exchange intervention is that these amounts are very important. So in our sample, we'll end just on the 16th of September 1992, when George Soros broke the Bank of England, as people usually say in news headlines. And on this day, the Bank of England actually spent 22 billions, and that's the same as the annual GDP of Croatia and Bulgaria combined at the time. So I think that's quite impressive that what it took, two entire populations a year to build was lost in a few hours on the market by the Bank of England. I mean, lost is a bit too much because they didn't lose the money, but they lost it to the market. We can talk about this later. And then there's a point to make. If you take the number of countries and not their GDP, most countries today intervene on the foreign exchange market. And on the other hand, when you look at research, we actually don't really know how to deal with this because we don't have much data. A lot of central banks do not share their data and keep it secret. And even some of the central banks that do share it, if you think of Turkey or South Africa, which have in the past or sometimes shared it, they would sometimes still run operations on futures markets, which would not be recorded in foreign exchange intervention. And I think something that's quite interesting as well is that when people survey central bankers, they, at least that was in 2008, that's sort of the last sort of survey data we have, they tend to say that they think that central bank foreign exchange intervention works, is effective. And then if you look at the literature, it's been going back and forth a bit, but I guess modern literature is a bit more positive. But in 2008, for example, when this survey was conducted, the literature was pretty much fairly negative towards central bank intervention and saying that it might not have an effect. So I'm just going to give you a brief overview of what I would be talking about for the next 30 to 40 minutes. So in this paper, I'm going to, and this is sort of my headline figure, meaning to shock you and hook you to this paper. And here I'm saying that by looking at the Bank of England between 1986 and 1992, so that's roughly a period when they were shadowing the Deutsche Mark and trying to peg to the Deutsche Mark and entering the ERM. They managed to, interventions were successful 8% of the time when they were going against market conditions. And then in other studies, which I'll detail in more precisely later, but we can find success rates for fixed exchange rate regimes by 80%. And so I'm going to try to deconstruct these two figures. And I think a lot of this presentation is going to try to convince you that potentially this 80% is a bit high. And then you make your own mind up on whether you believe my 8% or not. But that'll be what we'll be doing today. And so I think the main question today is, can we measure the impact of foreign exchange intervention, knowing that it happens often as a reaction to market conditions? So think if there's a shock in the market, there's bad news coming, for example, in an emerging market, there's an announcement that the US is going to raise rates, or as you've seen it recently, announcements that long-term rates are going up. Well, that might put pressure on emerging markets, and that might push their central banks to intervene. And so the question is, can we disentangle this intervention as a reaction to the market news, and can we then measure impact of the intervention? That's what I'm trying to do in this paper. Just so we know what we're talking about. So what is sterilized intervention? Because here we're only looking at sterilized interventions, and it is official purchase and sales of foreign exchange that monetary authorities undertake to influence exchange rates. And then the sterilized part means that it's not affecting monetary conditions. And this influencing exchange rate is quite important because there really needs to be an intention to want to impact the market. Yeah. And so this is some very advanced drawing I've done in a software you might know. It's called Paint, and it took me a lot of labor of love. So I hope you really appreciate the drawing. So before I describe what's happening on this, I need to do a disclaimer. The physics on these pictures are wrong. So if you are the central banker here and you're blowing on a sail, there's no way you can push the boat in one direction. So you'll have to just assume in this model of a boat that this guy can actually push this. Physically, it's not possible, but we'll just assume it's possible. And so what are we looking at here? We're looking at an intervention that goes against the wind. And this language comes from central bankers. And it just means that the market is pushing the exchange rate in one direction, and the central bank is trying to push the exchange rate in another direction. And that's a traditional intervention where you're trying to reverse the impact of the foreign exchange market. So that's one case. Then there's another case when the central bank goes in the same direction as the market. And you might ask, why would the central bank do this? There's various reasons. Some could be dependent on timing. Maybe the central bank was doing this in the morning and the market switched in the afternoon. And so that's how I would measure this. The other reason could be that the exchange rate is really low and the central bank is trying to pile up to an encouraging push in one direction or the other. And then the third case, which is going to be really important in our identification here, is the case when there's no wind. So that's not really a technical term, that's sort of my invention. But the idea is on some days, there might not be much market news or much information for the market to take on. And on these days, the central bank would pretty much be alone, at least that's an assumption I'll make in this paper, to push the exchange rate in one direction or the other. And so I think a big contribution of this paper is that I'm showing new data. So I'm looking at 86 to 92, and I'm looking at 1,400 data points, 1,400 working days. And so this is daily intervention data, which is something that's actually quite rare to find. There's very few examples where we get daily intervention, and they're usually only limited in time. So here there's intervention data that I'll make available once it's published. So I think it's an interesting source of data for future research. And I think something that makes it even more interesting is that this data is not public data, so it's secret data, and it's obviously been accessed because we now have access to the archives of the Bank of England, but this data was never meant to be going to the public. So it's maybe a bit more truthful than other data sets you could find. And then the last really bonus of this data is that, and we can talk about this in the questions if you want, but because of a design of the Bank of England, all these operations were automatically sterilized. So these operations would not happen directly at the Bank of England. They would go through the exchange equalization account, which is the reserve account of the Bank of England. And any operation with the exchange equalization account had a counterpart in treasuries. So you'd always offset the effect of any intervention on monetary policy because of this design of the exchange equalization account. So I guess that's a great feature of this data, is that we know these interventions were automatically sterilized. And this is just to give you an idea of who we're looking at. So these are the people I've been studying for the past few years. They look very familiar to me by now, but I think what's really interesting in this picture, except for the 1990s hairdos and the very old school computers, is that actually most of these people, they're actually on the phone, right? And so yeah, this guy as well, I think, like most of them are on the phone, right? And what does that mean? That means that their job is mainly a job on the phone. They're mainly calling only a bunch of banks with which they're trying to do exchange dealings. And so what they do as well is they record all their data on reports. And that's one of these reports. So these are the dealers' reports. This is a day which is very special. So this is Black Wednesday, the 16th of September, 1992. And on that day, you can see that the bank lost 22 billion to the market. And you can also see it did a few other things. Well, it did something for the government, so maybe purchased something for the British government, or it did some foreign exchange transaction for the government. It received some interest on some of its reserves, I guess, and there's been some other sundry, some other operations. And I think I'm only going to focus in this paper on the market operations. So we know that these operations are really meant to be influencing the market. So they're called market operations. And this is the data I've collected. So this is the sample I'll be looking at. And you can see it stops here. Operations by the Bank of England did not stop, but at that point it stops being intervention because they no longer want to influence the exchange rate. And in 92, after Black Wednesday, the Bank of England decided to no longer play with, no longer try to intervene on foreign exchange markets and to target inflation. And that's what's happening from this point on. And the picture is actually cropped, but so this one goes up to minus 22 billion. And then these peaks go a bit higher and lower. I guess it gives you a good idea of what's happening on the market. And something else that's really interesting on this is that you can see that they're intervening almost every day. I think it's around 82%, if I remember the figure correctly. And so they're on the market very frequently. Okay. And so I remember I showed you these people on the phone, and actually who they were calling on the phone were these 4 other banks, right? And so this is how the foreign exchange market worked back then. It was a very concentrated market. We can think of it as a very large market, but there's actually very few players. In this case, there's only really 5 players who trade in a wholesale foreign exchange market, so who trade the big amounts. And so that means that information between these 5 actors are going to circulate very quickly because they're always on the phone, right? So it's very informal. And so they'll be like, oh, have you seen this news? Have you seen that news? And that's why I'm thinking, and that's part of my identification, that the Bank of England really has access to good information. And if you look at today, this is a share of the biggest dealers in foreign exchange. And you can see that roughly 64% of all foreign exchange is done only by 10 different banks, right? So that means the foreign exchange market is still a very concentrated market. And that's why it's sometimes not surprising when you see things like the LIBOR scandal, because it's a very concentrated industry, I guess. And so here I'm going to start talking to you about my identification and how I'm planning to deal with these issues that I've mentioned earlier of how to assess central bank intervention on the foreign exchange market. And so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take a methodology that's been used a lot in the literature, which is simply to measure success rate. And I'll define that very precisely in just a little bit. And then I'll start with these success rates. And then later on, I'll also introduce the narrative approach to try to fine tune the results I got from the first part. So how does this event study work? And so this is inspired from some work by Bordeaux, Humpage, and Schwartz in their 2015 book. And I'm using the same methodology, which allows to compare results. But essentially, this methodology is also used more or less similarly in other papers dealing with intervention efficiency. And so to start with, we need to define two different ways a central bank can intervene. So I'm calling defending interventions when the Bank of England, in our case, is selling foreign currency, trying to make the pound appreciate. So that's defending intervention. And restraining intervention is when they're actually selling their own currency to try to make their currency depreciate. So I think these are the two cases we'll be looking at. And because they're sometimes a bit different, and it's thought in the literature that defending interventions are easier, restraining interventions are easier, it's important to disentangle them. And to go back to the charts you saw earlier, so the negative values would be defending interventions and the positive values would be restraining interventions. And then I'm going to just measure success as a dummy, and I'm having 3 success criteria. And maybe instead of like reading this to you, I'll just run you through an example of how this would work. Okay, so imagine that there's a currency that's been depreciating from day t-2 to day t-1. And now we're during day t, and the central bank is deciding what to do. And they are going to try to intervene to make that exchange rate appreciate again. That's their policy goal. And we know this from reading the archives. It's very clear that their goal when they intervene is to make the currency appreciate or depreciate. But there's a lot of citations where you can really see why they're doing it. And so if we imagine that on that day they will intervene, there's several things that can happen. But one would be success criteria 1. It's if they can make the exchange rate, which was going down, appreciate again. So they can reverse the fall of the exchange rate and then make it appreciate. The other option is that the exchange rate was depreciating, but they intervene, and following the intervention, it depreciates less than before. And one of the issues is in doing this, we cannot measure the counterfactual, right? And that's going to be what I'm trying to do with my narrative approach. I'll try to get a better look at the counterfactual and see how we can deal with this. But for now, the first attempt is just this success methodology. And then I'll have success criteria 3 as well, which is just a combination of the two of them. And that's going to give us an idea of how successful interventions are. And these are just the simple results. They're just given you as percentages to give you an idea. And then we'll dive into the narrative approach and try to get a bit more deeper, more interesting results, let's say. And so you can see that, well, overall, they're less successful than and they're more often not successful than they are successful. So these percentages are just the number of days in our sample when they manage to do either of these things. So either make the exchange rate reverse, make it go down less, or both of them for the last line. And you can see that they're not extremely successful at doing this, and it's already a bit lower than the estimates I've mentioned earlier from other elements in the literature. But now I'm going to run you through the narrative approach to try to see if we can take these results and improve on them. And that's what we will do now. So narrative approaches are often dated back to Friedman and Schwartz, and then they've really took off in the literature with the Romers. And they have a lot of paper on this where they look at monetary policy. And so I think it's a very interesting approach. And so Eric Monet, sorry, gives a definition of what the narrative approach is. So he says it's to examine archival evidence directly concerning policymakers' intentions and decisions. And here we'll be looking at that exactly. And I'll be looking at the report I've shown you earlier by the dealers of the Bank of England, and we'll see if they think they're going against the wind or with the wind. So this is an example of these reports of August 1992. And so you can see, I'm going to read this to you. So sterling came into attention today following a US report forecasting that the UK government would not be able to resist the devaluation. So the dealers picked up that there was a report saying that they would never resist the devaluation. And that's obviously bad news for the pound. And then there were also rumors denied by number 10, so denied by the government, that the chancellor had resigned. So there's a rumor which is not true, which is based on nothing, but it's on the market and it's impacting the exchange rate. And here again, we can see it's very interesting because if you were using variables only, you could never pick something like this up. And then they're saying heavy selling was seen throughout the afternoon and sizable support was required at the margin. So that means they intervened to try to reverse these negative elements. And I think this is very emblematic because you can see that even a rumor is picked up in this narrative approach. I'll show you exactly how to do this, but I think that's one of the strengths of this approach is that we can really pick up different elements. And so what I'll be doing I've read all these paragraphs for my sample, and I've decided myself whether they were good, neutral, or bad. So bad news for sterling. And so again, here, good and bad is not a moral judgment I'm making, but it's simply me deciding whether it goes is good is going to lead to appreciation of sterling, whereas bad is going to lead to depreciation. And that's simply what I'm trying to assess when I'm reading these paragraphs. And so I'm going to give you some examples. And these, again, are the way I've classified them. So you might disagree, right? And that's when it gets interesting. I'll tell you more about how I deal with the subjectivity in these choices. So so for example, a simple case would be opinion polls. So there's good opinion polls and press comments. Well, that happens usually on the weekend. And then on the Monday, that would be good news for sterling. And then the other interesting thing is that while I don't use variables for German monetary policy, for example, I do use it in the sense that one of the things they're obviously very concerned with, just like emerging markets today are concerned about issues of taper tantrum, they're concerned about interest rates in Germany because at the time they are in the ERM with all other currencies in Europe, and obviously Germany is the central currency in the system. And then I think the most interesting ones are the neutral ones. They would write, for example, the markets were quiet again. And so what I'm taking from this is that there's not much movement either way on the market. And then what I'll get to is that this is maybe a day where it's easy to influence the market, and we'll use this later. And then I think one that's very interesting is the last one as well. Dealers were unimpressed by the CBI surveys, and sterling tended to move lower with the dollar. And so here, this is really interesting because if you take any survey or any figure, 4% of GDP growth can be good news or it can be bad news. And if you only take the figure, it's very hard to assess whether it's good news or bad news, right? Even higher growth in China sometimes today, which is very high, can mean bad news if analysts were expecting the opposite, right? And the good thing is here that the dealers decode this and they read to us at the time what analysts were expecting and how it goes against or with the expectations. And remember that these guys are talking to the 5 major banks that deal on the foreign exchange market. So they really get these feelings from other people, these impressions. They might call Westminster Bank, and the Westminster Bank might say, today is terrible, this is terrible news. And then they'll catch this information, they'll read newspapers and other sources, and they'll get this idea of how the market is doing. And then, and I think that's very important to assess the success of intervention. So in an environment with good news, the currency will appreciate, and in an environment with bad news, it will depreciate. And I think it's a good counterfactual way to analyze, to get to this counterfactual I showed you earlier, because the success of an intervention deeply depends on the market conditions, right? So when there's good news and the central bank is trying to make the market, the exchange rate appreciate, it's going to be much easier. But if there's bad news and it's trying to make it I think I messed that one up. So let me start over. If there's good news and the central bank is trying to make the currency depreciate, for example, that's going to be more difficult than if there's good news and it's trying to make it appreciate. So I guess the context really matters here. And then the last thing we can use in this identification, we can use neutral days when not much is happening and the conditions are not going either way. And so using this, I've classified the success rate I showed you earlier, and I've classified them by favorable conditions, so with the wind interventions, and neutral conditions, and adverse conditions, so against the wind intervention. So, and I think this is just mainly the main results, and I told you about the 8% figure at the beginning, and that's where it's coming from. So these are defending interventions in light green and restraining intervention in dark green. And so that what that means is that when they're trying to make sterling appreciate against the Deutschmark in conditions that are bad, for example, Germany just raised interest rates, they go on the market to try to make sterling appreciate, and then their success rate is only of 8%. And so I think that's really important, because this is probably the case when you'd want your interventions to be the most effective. And what we're picking up here, we're picking up that they're less successful because obviously they're going against adverse conditions. And then the rates when they're going with the market are much higher. And I think a good way to think about this is that neutral conditions are a way to measure the actual impact of a central bank, right? Because, so that's the point here. Because when there's no other market conditions impacting the exchange rate, so if it's a really quiet day and they go in the market, they can really have an impact. And that's what I'm picking up here. And so that's why one of the claims of the paper is that this 34 to 42 is very close to what would be the actual impact of a central bank, taking into account other market conditions. Okay. And so, yeah, I think these neutral conditions really help picking up on a day when the central bank is the only one trying to move the exchange rate. And then the adverse condition is also very important. And so here I've also put on this slide how this compares to the literature. So I guess the people who have done something most similar are Bordeaux, Hampage, and Schwartz. And in their paper, they found success rates for US interventions, and here in the UK, US interventions against the mark, roughly in a similar time period. And they found something between 21 and 60%, depending on the conditions, and depending on whether it's on the success criteria. And so, again, what's important here is that these estimates do not account for the wind, so for what the market news are on a given day. And then I think another study that's very interesting, so this is an AEJ macro paper, and these guys, they look at a lot of different interventions by central banks in a sample from 95 to 2011. And again, they do not account for the direction of the wind. And here, for all the narrowband countries, they found success rate of between 78 and 84%. So it's a huge success rate when you compare it to what I find either against the wind or what I find in sort of market neutral conditions, which would be the true effect of central bank intervention, if you will. Okay. And so now I'm going to dive into, so this is sort of the main finding I've shown you, but I think what's very important is to understand how objective the narrative approach is. And I think that's another contribution of the paper, is that most people doing narrative approaches, we always have to rely on the authors, right? And so they would say, look, we've assessed these 2 events or these 10 events, and we've decided that they have this impact or they do this. But the issue is there's no way to objectively know whether the author is just trying to, make the cases look like they should, or if there's actually something. And I'm sure Natasha can then tell us later that she probably got a lot of these comments, right? People telling, because she's done a paper also using a narrative approach, and then people will go, yeah, but are you not just cherry picking? And so this is sort of an answer to these people, is saying, well, let's see if I am cherry picking, right? And so that's why here I rely on 2 things. I'm picking 100 of my paragraphs randomly out of the 1900 I've coded, and I decide to test them against 2 things. So the first is Amazon Mechanical Turk, and the second is natural language processing. So for Amazon Mechanical Turk, I essentially put these statements, these 100 statements, on the internet, and I ask strangers who know nothing about the economy. They know nothing about exchange rates, or I'm guessing they do. Maybe some economists spend their spare time on Turk, but I don't think so. And so I'll ask them to just assess whether my paragraphs are positive, negative, or neutral as well. Just the same thing that I did myself. And then I'll show you how also the natural language processing algorithm does the same thing. And by doing this, these are the results. And so here on top, you can see my answers. So these are all the of these 100 statements, all the ones I've characterized as good, then the ones I've characterized as neutral and negative. And I'll show you some more detailed data on this later, but essentially what you can already see is that maybe on the neutral side, I might be a bit wrong, right? So I think that's something we can then discuss. But the idea is to see on top, so these 10 people are the 10 reviewers from Amazon Mechanical Turk. So these are the 10 strangers on the internet I've asked for their opinion. And this is their mode. So I'm comparing my answers to their mode. So the most frequent answer you get here. And if you look at the good ones, we pretty much agree. There's sometimes when I think it's good and they think it's neutral. And there's some cases, and these are probably mistakes on my side or on the S side, who knows, where actually they've been classified as bad by them, and I say that they're good or they're positive, and they say it's negative. And then on the neutral one again, there seem to be disagreeing. And at the bottom, I'm using the NLTK algorithm, and that's a natural processing algorithm, which will review all the texts, and it will decide whether it has good or positive or negative content. And this text has been trained on movie reviews mainly, I think. So they would read a movie review which has 4 stars or 5 stars and see how these stars affect the text. And maybe they'll find things like, people would put a lot of exclamation marks when it's very bad, but then not if they use the word good. And so this natural language processing algorithm has been trained not by me, but by experts to pick up on good, neutral or negative text. And then the other subtlety is that the colors here they're not the same as here, right? They're more nuanced because here I actually get an index. I get an index from -1 to +1, whereas I only assess everything from 1, 0, or -1. So we have different ways of assessing. And same for the people on Amazon Mechanical Turk, they would only assess it as good, neutral, or negative, whereas here we get a range. And so this is just a visual way to see it, but maybe there's a better way to see it in data. And so again, here, it's pretty much the same table with the same colors, but it's maybe a bit more convincing, I think. And so these are the averages responses for everything, and they're classified by the answer I gave, right? So all the ones I gave -1 on average had a score of -1. That's just by definition. And all the ones I gave score 0 have an average score of 0. And then I'm comparing this with the results of the algorithm and the results of mturk. And you can see that what I like in this table is that when I'm in negative territory, all the other two are in negative territory, and that doesn't happen in any of the other situations, right? And then on the neutral part, you can see that when I assess something as neutral, well, mturk people are more optimistic than me, but they're still less optimistic on average than when they're assessing a good text, right? And I think here, these mistakes or these differences, these discrepancies come really from the fact that the Bank of England might be saying, today was a very quiet day, but overall not too bad, or markets were not doing too bad, or were doing well. And then this is something I would classify as neutral, because I think if there's not much activity, this is typically one of these days I can identify to see what the true impact of the Bank of England is. Whereas these guys probably just think, oh, there's a positive word in there, let me mark it as positive. And then again, for the algorithm, you can see that the algorithm pretty much agrees with me in the sense that it's negative when I'm negative, and it's more positive when I'm positive. And the lower range here is just coming from the fact that the algorithm would never say -1 unless the statement would be terribly bad, right? Or you would never say a +1 neither unless it was like really ecstatic. And because these people are British, I think the thing we're picking up here is just their Britishness, right? They would never see it too far. They'd always be very reserved and very put together. And so I think that's sort of what we're getting here, the reserved way of saying. During the worst crisis, they would say, oh, today was a quite terrible day, or they would be very nuanced in their assessment. So I think that the low range here just means on average, British people tend to be less dramatic than other people, if that makes sense. And so here's just to give you like a distribution of these things to sort of retake these points. So this is my distribution. So all the scales are the same. And this is how much time, this is the number of these 100 statements, which are either flagged as negative, positive, or neutral. And then you can see that the algorithm is a bit more flatter. There's quite a few statements around 0, but apart from that, there's quite a range there. And then these are the people on the internet. And as we already saw, they're a bit more positive than I am. And that might be because a lot of these statements I'm classifying as neutral, but they might have a positive note in it, or the word good in it, or something like that. And so I think that's just to show you how these different ways work. And so what I've done here with this is just trying to convince you that I have not, retrofitted my narrative approach to have my results, right? So this narrative approach is really quite objective. And again, I think the argument is really not that strangers on the internet should be used to assess whether, assess economic conditions and set the narrative approach. But I think it's more to say, well, I just want to show you that what I've done is fairly objective. And even if you ask strangers who understand nothing about this, they'll sort of agree with me. And that's sort of like the idea here. And same with an algorithm that's actually blind, it would also agree with my classification. Obviously not perfectly, but roughly. Yeah. Okay. And I think I might even finish a bit earlier, but that's great. Then we'll have more time to really discuss and have questions. And so I think what I've tried to show you is that when we take into account market conditions, we can get to something closer, which is the true impact of a central bank. And so here, this estimation for the sample of the Bank of England would be that they were able to influence market conditions, to influence market exchange rates 34 to 42% of times, depending whether it's restraining or defending intervention. And I think the main takeaway of this study is really to have a word of caution when you're trying to assess central bank intervention, because obviously most of the time it happens at the same time as some news, or as it's a reaction to some news, right? And I think that's what I'm trying to show here, is that I'm trying to capture this news to which it's reacting and show how that changes things. And I think the other figure to remember is this 8%, and that's 8% of intervention when they're trying to reverse exchange rates and they're going against market trends. So that's a very low success rate. And I think that's also interesting to see that market conditions really have a big impact on the way a central bank intervenes. And yeah, I think that was all I had.
Okay, thank you very much, Alain. That was really fascinating, I found. So audience, this is now your opportunity to ask questions if you want. So please do so in the Q&A space if you can. We're going to start with a question from Harold James. So if Harold James is okay to be unmuted, we will ask him to perhaps ask his question if he's okay.
The question is this. So if you imagine a day on which the market is selling sterling very heavily, and the Bank of England is trying to buy to support sterling, that's your leaning against the wind case. The price of sterling may go down, but it might not go down by as much as it would have done if the Bank of England had not intervened. And so the bank would claim that they're being successful and that they're making the market more orderly. And their criteria of success and failure is not necessarily what the market is doing in terms of moving the exchange rate on that day.
Yeah, I think that's a brilliant question, and obviously you know the archives very well. But I think what I really found by reading, I think one of the reports that really convinced me what they're trying to do is this report before the 1956 election, I think. And Roy Bridge, the head trader, is saying exactly, he's planning two scenarios, right? I think, as always, I think a Labour victory would send sterling down, and a Conservative victory would send sterling up, right? That's usually roughly what happens in this period. And so he says pretty much, he really analyzes everything, and you can really see that his goal when he's describing these two scenarios is really to make the exchange rate appreciate when it's intervening and depreciate. So I think the goal is really to move markets, especially on days when there's a lot of stress. And I think The orderly market is also something that's important, but I think more than that, if you really read the people who are doing this, and these are currency traders, right? They want to win, they want to make the exchange rate move. And I think that's really what you pick up from, I mean, that's how I read their intentions at least. And then, but you're right, I think the counterfactual is still a bit of an issue because it might be, there might be an issue there. And I agree that I don't completely deal with this. But the idea is by looking at neutral days that I'm trying to pick up some of this by looking at the day when there's no other event happening than just the Bank of England and the market.
I mean, if I could just follow up on that, you know, in that sense, the Bank of England traders have a very different set of motivations than the traders in a commercial market. The commercial traders are clearly going to make a profit, but the Bank of England, on the extreme example on the 16th of September 1992, they know that they're not going to make a profit on that, but they're trying to, you know, they're trying to see whether they can have any effect at all on the price, and you know, in the end, of course, they can't.
Yeah, I think that's.
But they have a different motivation. That's really the key point.
Yeah, I think, I mean, on the motivation, I mean, I generally agree with you, but you know, if I were to disagree, or if I were to be a bit cheeky, I would quote Milton Friedman, right? And what the point he's making, and the literature around maybe like 30, 40 years ago was making, is that a central bank can only be successful if it's profitable. I don't think that's true anymore. I don't think that's the point of the literature, but I think that's sort of a counterpoint on do dealers want to make a profit? I mean, whether they want to do it instinctively or not, it's part of a success measure as well. And then on Black Wednesday, I mean, I've spoken to Bill Allen and other people who were there, and obviously, also the literature would say the same thing. They were not trying to make sterling appreciate. They were just following what the government had to say, right? So I think it was sort of exogenous to their decision. But I think my focus is more on all of the small interventions every day, and it'd be more like a random day where, and because it's a percentage of all these operations, even if Black Wednesday had a huge impact, it would only impact my results slightly, right? So I'm more looking on your average Wednesday when, you know, nothing's happening, and then the Bank of England would try to reverse the exchange rate in one direction or the other. But it's a great point. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Harold. We've got another question here, which I think was very much related to Harold's initial question, which is, isn't it predictable in some sense that a defense of a currency will always be more difficult? I don't know if you want to answer this, so if we can maybe move on to another question. If we move on to another question, this will be the one by Juan Flores. Maybe Juan wants to speak, so I'm going to unmute Juan. So there you go, Juan. Let's go ahead with your question.
Hi, Natasha. Thank you. Thank you, Alan. Now, I was wondering regarding the tolerance that the central bank may have to specific appreciation or depreciation levels at specific moments, right? It may be that because, you know, the different levels of reserve may also lead to different tolerance to more or less depreciation. And I wonder whether that, in a sense, conditions also your results.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, right? Yeah, I mean, there's another paper with Jacob Weber. He's a PhD student at Berkeley, where we actually take this suggestion and work on data on Bretton Woods. And one of the things we look at is we use an IV where we look at the level of reserves, and we try to see whether the level of reserves can be used as an IV to describe the effect of intervention. But I mean, level of reserves would have an impact, but I mean, from one day to the other, the level of reserves would rarely really move, and I'll move too much, I guess. And I think, yeah, I'm not sure how much that's in their mind, because they have a, yeah, I think on the first point was whether it was a question about whether they really care about it every day and have sort of a short-term outlook, or they sort of think of it that much. I think they have a band, right? I think that's the other thing to say. When they join the ERM, they're within a very fixed band, right? And so they really have to monitor every small movement, because if they get out of the band that's fixed, they would break the band and leave the ERM, right? And so there's a very clear mandate on the band, which is really driving what they're doing, I think. And so I think they don't have that much leeway to let the exchange rate depreciate, as say Colombia would have today, or other emerging markets would have today, because they're really in a fixed exchange rate system on most of the sample.
Okay, thanks, Alain, and Juan as well. Now, we start to have quite a few questions about sort of your narrative approach, of course, as you probably would have expected, and the ways in which you decided to classify the input from the Bank of England employees, and whether you might have also added some other information out there. So I'm going to start on this theme. I'm going to start with Maëlys Avaro's question. So Maëlys, I will unmute you. So if you want to go ahead with your question, if that's okay.
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, great. Thanks. I wanted to ask Alain whether you could check for the date for which there are an ambiguity between your note of -101 between with the notes from the algorithm and the Amazon people. If you could run the same test, but on another source, on the market sentiment. I was thinking of looking at newspaper and whether they would describe this day as a good or neutral or bad day in terms of an exchange, and see and try to measure your bias, whether you are more toward neutral rates compared to the algorithm, thanks to like a second sources of market sentiment. Not sure it's clear.
Yeah, no, for example, that's a very good suggestion, right? And there's a lot of things that are being done in this space of reading newspapers and sort of getting sentiment out of it. So I think that's definitely something I should consider looking into. And I think, yeah, that's definitely valuable. And then on the days, I have some input on the days when I'm wrong. I mean, I think one of the very humbling thing about this is there has been days when I was just plain wrong, right? So I don't know, I must have like looked out of the window because I've done 1900 of these. So some of these just because, you know, I had a fat finger, as traders would say, or maybe I didn't put the minus or someone distracted me. So like there's somewhere where I just can see that my judgment is wrong. And I think that's quite interesting as well. I haven't changed them because I think they're part of the error term. But yeah, there's some of these hundreds where I'm just plainly wrong. And then there's some, I think the more common case when I just compare these two is I see that I've put the neutral judgment because I thought there was really not much happening on the market. And so I thought that would be closer to what a true effect of the Bank of England intervention would be. But yeah, no, but I think great suggestion. I'll definitely look into see if I can do more with newspapers. That'd be very helpful.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Maëlys. So a related question, I think, has to do with sort of whether things outside the UK in particular might influence the sterling dollar exchange rate or sterling Deutschmark exchange rate. And so I'm going to ask Michael Bordeaux, if he's okay, to ask his question. So I'm going to unmute him. So go ahead, Mike, if you want to go ahead with your question.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, Alain, fantastic presentation, by the way. I've heard this a few times, but this is really great. So my question is about the source of the news. So you've been looking at UK sources, right? But would that matter? Let's say you looked at Switzerland. Okay, and there's, you know, the gnomes of Zurich. Okay, would you get a different perspective? I mean, you know, you've already said the British tend to be a bit reserved, and the Swiss tend to be a bit hard-headed. So I'm just wondering if that is something that could be looked at in terms of robustness. So it's not just Switzerland, but other players all around the world might have different perspectives on this in terms of the narrative.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. It'd be good to have something a bit more exogenous than, I guess, yeah, that's one of the shortcomings here, right? There might be, I think one of the biases you could get at with your comment would be to say, well, you know, these reports go to their bosses, and so maybe they don't want to, you know, they don't want to show certain things, or there might be some sort of biases, and they might be also too focused on the UK. That's a good point. But I think at the same time, this is also the strength of this, is because these guys really know what's happening on this specific market, right? So if you get sources from another country, that might be less important for sterling. But then again, yeah, maybe sources from the US could be a good way to cross-check, right? See, if I'm taking Maëlys's suggestion to go on newspaper, it'd be good to compare maybe US newspapers to British newspapers and see if there's actually a bias there. I think that's a very good idea. Yeah, thanks, Mike.
Yeah, so I have a couple of questions as well on this topic, but I won't abuse my privilege as a chair here. And we're going to move on to a slightly different topic. And I'm going to ask, in particular, Roger Vickery to ask his question. So, Roger, please go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me? Yes. Hello?
Yeah, we can hear you.
We can hear you.
Alain, yes. So I'm not sure if my question makes sense. It's more, I mean, I'm new to the intervention literature. Does it make sense to look at the success of intervention just in terms of the direction it goes, and not take into account, I mean, the kind of cost benefit of intervention? So how much they manage to move the exchange rate compared to how much they spend in intervening. Is there something you can look at, or does it make sense? I was just curious.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good question, and yeah, I think that's definitely something that would be good to. I mean, the honest answer is really I've tried, and I've used a lot of brain power, and people have talked to me about this, and the results are very disappointing, and I think that's sort of one of the issues. So you could put this into a regression setting, right? And then you get exactly what you're getting at, right? And I've tried to do this, but then the results don't really bring you anything really. I mean, the results you essentially find from doing regressions is that it's the endogenous results. You find that every day the central bank intervenes, it's actually doing the opposite of what it's planning to do. And I think that's why this whole literature has avoided using regressions and trying to quantify. I mean, there's some, so the paper I mentioned with my co-author, we're using an IV and we think we get to something where we see sort of the expected impact. But I think here, yeah, I think it's very difficult to use regressions and to get like this quantitative impact that you're looking at. And that's why even top papers, so there's one of the papers that was in AJ Macro, they used something similar, right? They use this event study because they know that regressions just are not good enough. And I think the other thing is because, yeah, it's the amount that they're using is so endogenous as well, right? So they would spend 22 billion on Black Wednesday, but maybe on your normal Tuesday, they would spend just like, much less, a million or 2 million. And I think this is so linked to what's happening on the market and what the market is doing that it's very hard to disentangle this. And that'd be great to do with this approach, but I don't think it brings any satisfying results. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Jose. I've got a question here from Masato Shizume. If he wants to ask his question as well, I'm gonna unmute him. So go ahead. About the distinctive feature of successful cases. Hello?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just wondering if the successful cases were different in nature from the other less successful cases. For example, the nature of the shocks which the central bank should deal with. I think.
Yeah, I think that's a very fair and great question. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so I think if we take Black Wednesday, which is the biggest shock, I think I think at some point markets made their mind, and there was no central bank that could stop this. And so I think you're very right? So I think this is sort of the flip question of Roger's question. He was asking, well, can you not measure, the impact of intervention? And here you're sort of asking, well, can you not sort of get a more nuanced, good, bad, or neutral, right? Because like a bad day might be just slightly bad, or it might be Black Wednesday bad. And if it's Black Wednesday bad, obviously it's going to be very different from just, maybe a bad headline about something that was in one of the newspapers, right? So I think that's a very good one. I think that's generally a limitation as well of what I'm doing here. Maybe a way to get at your point would be to, so now I've only used the machine learning algorithm to cross-check on 100 statements whether what I did made sense. But maybe if I would use the machine learning algorithm on all the statements, I'd have an objective way of measuring, very bad days versus slightly bad days versus good day, so I'd have more range, right? Because the algorithm doesn't give you a 1 or a 0, it gives you a number between -1 and 1, which is a discrete number. And so if I had this discrete number from the algorithm, I think that's something that would be sort of dealing with this, right? So we could expect on Black Wednesday, dealers would say this was the worst day ever. Well, they wouldn't say that because they're British and they'd be very reserved, but they would say something along those lines. So I think that's a very good point, and I think that might be an interesting avenue to go into as well. So thanks.
Thanks.
Yes, thanks a lot, Masato. So I think we only have 2 or 3 minutes or so, maybe for one last question. So I'm going to ask Eric Monet to be the last person to ask a question, if that's okay. So go ahead, Eric.
Hi, thank you, Natasha. So my question was just about trying to think about this assessment of the effectiveness of exchange rate intervention, except foreign exchange interventions in a more dynamic setting. So as I wrote in the chat, how would you assess that acting with a favorable condition of the market today actually is not something that is helping the bank tomorrow and preventing that the market worsen its condition? Because I think that the way that you measure success is really like day by day, and it's not obvious that it's the only way to look at success.
Yeah, I think that's a very fair point. And I mean, if you're interested in the topic of intervention, Majori made a lecture at the BIS recently, and that really resonates with your comment. But he was saying for him, intervention would be effective, over a period of like 8 months, right? And so I think that's another way to look at it, right? You could say, well, this intervention over 8 months led to an appreciation of X%. And that's really not what I'm doing here, right? Here, it's really this during the day. The question is, did intervention during that given day have any impact on the exchange rate? And it is a very narrow focus, but I guess one of the justifications of it, and I think it's a paper by Dominguez and Corta, which shows that any market news is usually, or like any intervention news, I think they look at monetary policy, if I'm not mistaken, but they might be looking at intervention as well. I mean, foreign exchange intervention, but they say that any news is priced into the market in like 2 to 3 hours, right? And I think so that's very interesting, right? So that's sort of this effect I'm looking at here. And I think another reason not to look long term. So if you remember the chart I showed you at the beginning, you can really see that the Bank of England is on a peg, and B does always intervenes in one direction or the other. And so I think because of this very tight peg, they always go one direction or the other. And that means the long-term effect is harder to pinpoint. So thanks.
Thanks, Alain. Thanks, Eric, as well. Okay, so I think we've finished the sort of formal Q&A part of today's seminar. So I'm going to thank the presenter for his really brilliant presentation, and members of the audience also for their participation. We're going to move to a more informal session in about a minute or so, just a few seconds. And in this more informal session, we'll be taking up questions from the audience that are remaining, and we'll just be having a slightly more informal chat. So if you want to stay with us, please do so. You're very welcome. The last thing I would like to mention is that there won't be a seminar next week. So the next webinar that we're going to have will be on April the 14th. And that will be a talk by Pavitra Suryanarayan called Hollowing Out the State, Franchise and Fiscal Capacity in Colonial India. Right, so I'm just going to pause for 3 seconds just to mark the end of the session and then move to the more informal one. Thank you very much. Okay, hello everyone and welcome back. So we're going to start with this more informal session. We've still got actually a couple of questions from the audience. So perhaps we could start with those. If you want to go ahead. So we're going to start with, I've got a question here from Chris Meisner. You want to go ahead, Chris?
Yeah. Hey.
You could even turn on your video if you want. It's just, yeah. That's okay.
I don't see a video icon on the Zoom, but you can hear me, right? Yeah.
We can hear you.
I was typing up my question and hit return, but and I only half formulated my question, but I guess so. Thanks, Alan. This is great. One question I had was maybe you could I'm kind of thinking like of an out of sample test of reliability, and then that doesn't really work in this case, but maybe you could like invert things and like get the outcome, and then you know, turn it around and see how many times you know, the outcome was kind of consistent with the actions of the Bank of England that you were, you know, quote unquote unaware of. And then just following up on the last question, I mean, I think the strategies seem really static here, and you want to think about more dynamic strategies and signaling to the market, and sometimes big moves. Anyways, that's great. Thanks. Nice to see you.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Chris.
Yeah, that's it.
Perfect. I just need to say that this feels almost more like a birthday party than an actual seminar, because of all the great people you get to catch up with. So I think that's really nice to see everyone here. Yeah, I think on your point of what they're trying to do, I think you're right that there is some signaling and some trying to surprise the market, right? So one of the documents I read is a briefing from the Bank of England to the Fed officials. So they usually overnight they would pass the baton, so to speak. They would let the Fed deal with intervention, right? And then in this document, you can really see Roy Bridge explaining to his alternate at the Fed what he suggests him to do. And he says, well, you know, last week we went into the morning like this week, please try to wait until the afternoon until you get in to try to surprise the market. So there's definitely a bit of that. And on the signaling part, I think that might not necessarily apply, because these interventions were secret and they were meant to be secret, right? And there's only a few instances where they communicate that they're intervening. I think on the 1400 sample, it's maybe 20 or 30 occasions. For example, on Black Wednesday, that's what they do. For first, they intervene secretly. And again, secret is very debatable, because they obviously tell the commercial banks to sell them or buy them currency. But so they would start secretly, and then when they see that they really want to have an impact, then they will say, oh, today we're actually going on the market. And that's the signaling part, but it's very limited in this sample. But yeah, I think these are definitely things to look into, and I think that's I think another thing, yeah, linked to your identification issue. I mean, something I could do in the dynamic nature of the process is look at episodes, right? So like say 3 days of intervention, and then see what happens if they go in the same direction. And I think that's what Fracture et al. Do in their paper as well. And I think that would maybe make a bit more sense to take an intervention episodes, which would be like 4 or 5 days going in the same direction, and then have sort of a rule there, and then measure the impact of this rather than just measure the intraday impact, or additionally to measuring the intraday impact. But thanks for the question.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Chris. So Rui, would you like to ask your question?
Absolutely, they're actually questions. So first of all, you know, this is great work. So thanks for bringing it to us today. So I have, you know, my questions, I guess, follow on some of the threads previously mentioned. So following up on Roger's question, so were these traders not operating under their budget constraint? Right? Because you're trying to qualify success as if there was an infinite supply of foreign exchange reserves. Of course, it wasn't the case. There was one moment when they had to give up, right, at the end of your study period. But did they have some kind of internal instructions that they could only spend X% of the outstanding reserves intervening every day, or something like that, right? So, or did they perceive that they were limited by that? And related with that, if that budget constraint bound, was there any attempt to cooperate with other banks, right? So you're assuming that the Bank of England was on its own defending the pound with no other further cooperation. That's probably not the case. Then related, so you do a great job using, you know, these confidential notes on the appreciation of the state of the market, but it's not exactly what most narrative studies do, right? So they try to you quoted Eric, right? They tried to figure out what was the intention of the policymaker rather than the appreciation of the policymaker state of the market. So for instance, the question is, what was the reason to intervene in neutral days? Right? So if the pound was steady as it goes, why did the Bank of England decide to intervene? That might get you a little bit more mileage. And finally, cheap critique, Lucas critique, right? So, these banks, it's a small numbers group, right? Once the banks observed or got the call from the Bank of England, they probably would have changed their view of the market, right? So what's the source of information? Is it the Bank of England reacting to the animal spirits out there, or are the animal spirits actually following the Bank of England? Thank you.
Yeah, great. I mean, these are like brilliant questions. So I'll start with the last one. So, so I guess the thing to understand is that commercial banks could not react to the Bank of England, or at least that's what sort of the identification argues, because the Bank of England does two things. One, it does intervention, which is the market line I've shown you on my dealers report, but it also does operations for other central banks. So it could be that on a given day, they're selling 2 million or 200 million for the Bank of Italy. And the Bank of Italy needs to buy sterling. And, instead of going on the market, they call the Bank of England. They say, look, can you act as a dealer for us and buy us some sterling? And that means that these interventions get sort of randomized by the fact there's a lot of customer operations. So not a customer operation could just be, the government needs to buy weapons from another country, and this needs to be paid in dollars, and the payment is due tomorrow. Well, the government is not going to go to Barclays and ask them to buy foreign exchange. They're going to go directly to the Bank of England and say, look, can you lend us, or can you exchange us $200 million? And these operations come to sort of mess up what the banks get to pick up. So either they go with all the operations, but then they make stupid decisions because some of them are not meant to influence the exchange rate, or maybe they get a sense of what the bank's doing. But I think that's sort of like replying to this point, but I think it's something that we need to flesh out better in the paper. And then you're right, I'm a bit cheeky on the narrative approach. I understand that it's not exactly a narrative approach because I'm not looking at their mindset, right? I'm not looking at what they're trying to do. I'm looking at what they're observing. So, so I guess it's sort of on the margin of being a narrative approach. It's maybe more sort of an observational narrative approach or something like that. So I guess that there's a bit of maybe potentially a labeling issue, but I just thought it would make it clear in people's mind that what I'm doing is I'm reading text, and from this text I'm inferring informations which I'm adding into a sort of quantitative assessment. And then two last points, so cooperation and budget constraint. I think on the budget constraint, I mean, because the exchange rate until 1997, until 1997, the Bank of England is not independent, right? So they just get a mandate from the government to stay within the bands, and that's the only mandate they have. And if they were to not spend all their money and have a budget constraint, well, the government well, that's just not possible because that's not their mandate, right? The mandate is to do whatever it takes, and before Draghi already, whatever it takes to keep the exchange rate within the bands. And that's why Black Wednesday was sort of so dramatic, because there was a complete disconnect between the Bank of England, who knew there's nothing they could do, and the government, who was hesitating to change its policy. And I think 22 billion, I mean, it's the GDP of 2 countries at the time. I don't think the Bank of England would have rationally spent so much money. And that was clearly showing that they had no budget constraint. And of course, they were limited by reserves, but there's a lot of swap agreements that they had with the Fed. So reserves are sort of just the tip of the iceberg. And then maybe last point on cooperation. So I do have data, and that's data we used in a paper with Barry Eichengreen on the ERM crisis as well. And there we show that actually they were cooperating with other central banks, and they were communicating their operations among maybe 10, 15 central banks with the US, Japan, and then all the European central banks in a process called the consultation. And we've collected this consultation data, which shows who else is on the market. But what you can actually see, for example, the Bundesbank, which would be the natural ally in the situation when they're trying to avoid the pound crashing against the Deutschmark, only intervened, I think, on 6 occasions during my sample. So I think most of the interventions can sort of be seen as exogenous, because even though there was cooperation on a technical level, on an information sharing level, there was no intervention unless they hit the lower bound of the ERM, and then they were like contractually obliged to intervene, and then they did intervene. But that's again, that's a handful of days for Germany, and so that's not really going to impact my results too much. But I could try to take them out, or I think that's a valid point, and see if this changes something. But yeah, I mean, overall, great comments. I mean, they very helpful.
Yeah, actually, thanks, Marie. So actually, my question was gonna be about that precisely. So because you could very well think that other central banks' interventions would impact the exchange rate, but since central bank interventions are secret, as you say yourself. I mean, I don't know to what extent they were secret in various countries and so on, and to what extent there was communication between central banks, right, about what they were doing, even though they were secret to the wider public, right? But this secrecy can potentially be a problem for you in the sense that maybe you don't know exactly what's going on behind the doors of other central banks, etc. And so I was wondering whether there was a way in which you could take that into account. I mean, you partly answered the question by answering Rui's question, but I was wondering whether there was a way in which you could control for other central banks' interventions or something.
Yeah, I think that's definitely something I need to do. Right? So I think it's a very valid point, and I think that's either in my robustness checks or even in the main results to see if I get different percentages of success depending on whether I take it into account. But I mean, on when they share the data, so I think there was 4 times. That's sort of what we found in the literature, and there's a paper on this. There's 4 times a day, I think, when they had to share data, something like 9 a.m., 11 a.m., 2 p.m., and 4 p.m. And if I'm getting this right, before the actual intervention, everyone had to say, "Oh, I'm going to do this," and then and then there was free for all. You could do whatever you want within this announcement. But this data is really shared, and I think another reason why this concern is overblown is, well, the only context in which there would be well, I guess what they want to do with this consultation, which is this process, they want to avoid competitive, interventions, right? They don't want to be fighting against each other. But I think if everyone sticks to their own self-interest, there's actually very few occasions when they would actually be fighting that much. Because if the pound is crashing around against the Deutschmark, well, the Germans, they don't really care because for them it's going up and they're not going to do anything, for example, or another central bank. But then equally, if the Deutschmark was crashing, well, the Brits would be, well, this is good. Our exchange rate is appreciating. That's reassuring. And they can always, if they need to, they can always print money and buy as much. They have infinite, on the upper bound, they have infinite resources. On the lower bound, they don't have infinite resources, right? Reserves are limited. So I guess this asymmetry makes that actually, when your exchange rate is appreciating, you don't really mind. And when it's depreciating, that's when you are intervening, but the other central banks don't really mind. So I think that's why there's less overlap than we'd think in these operations, I think.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Alain, for answering these questions so well. Thank you to the audience for asking their questions so well. I think you've given a really brilliant presentation. We've had a really fascinating conversation here. So thanks a lot, Alain, and we're going to end the seminar here. See you on April the 14th.